Oklahoma City University. We have an important speaker with us, and I know that you're as anxious as I am to listen to his remarks, particularly given the recent headlines in the newspaper. Certainly makes his presence much more pertinent to us this evening. I also want to exhort you that time is of the essence. An ambassador is always on call by electronic means, and especially when there is conflict in the country in which he is serving. So to keep questions focused, I urge you to write down some of your questions in order to gain that focus and shorten the questions so that it gives the maximum time for the ambassador to respond, so we can squeeze in as many questions as possible. In addition, I want to change the format following his speech a bit, and that is I've shifted the cookies and the punch downstairs. And I ask you, after the question and answer session has ended, if you will wait before you come forth to shake the hand of the ambassador and meet him. I know he has lots of friends here in the audience, and after he speaks, he'll have many more admirers, I'm confident. If you will wait until I escort him downstairs to the Watson Lounge, then you will have the opportunity to speak with him and get much better acquainted. Pleasure to have the honor to introduce Ambassador Jones's better half, Olivia Jones, who is with us this evening. The Honorable James R. Jones comes to us not only from a fabled land, Mexico, but he is a fellow Oklahoman. He was born in Muskogee, Oklahoma, began his career as a legislative assistant to Congressman Ed Edmondson, 1961. He became President Lyndon Johnson's White House Chief of Staff during the period 1965 to 1969. He also endeared himself to many Oklahomans when he served 6 terms as a congressman from this state from 1973 until 1987. He has, however, worn many hats, and one of those hats from 1989 to 1993 recently was as the 15th chairman of the American Stock Exchange, a position he held for nearly 4 years. And knowing the needs of higher education, I hope he brought a few certificates for OCU. Finally, before I turn the podium over to our distinguished speaker, since August 20 of last year, he has served as the United States Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Mexico. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable James R. Jones.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for all the warm hospitality extended to Olivia and to me in our very brief stay in Oklahoma City. We had hoped it would be a little bit longer, but given the situation, we are going to have to go back early in the morning, but it's a delight to participate in this mid-year institute and to talk a little about what is occupying our time at the present time. Being here on campus, and talking to Dr. Walker and to many old friends who were important in my life and dear friends and who helped me along the way, but has brought back many fond memories for me, going back to dating some of the OCU girls when I was an undergraduate, to being able to speak here at OCU, at seminars for teachers and when they used to hold Oklahoma Boys State here, and so it's a great treat to be back. The topic assigned to me tonight is one in which our staff wrote a wonderful speech, and those of you who like to read speeches, I encourage you to get a copy and to read it, and I'm sure it's probably going to be much better than I'm going to talk about, but I thought it would be a little bit better to make a few notes and to talk about the topic that you've assigned to me, namely the partnership, not paternalism, with Mexico, a new good neighbor policy, and how that relates to the overall theme of your mid-year seminar institute, namely, America, is it on the ascent or on the decline? Because I think the two topics are very much interrelated, and if there are two words that would go through my thoughts on these topics, it would be the word change and the word attitude, and sometimes attitudinal change. Because I think whether you answer the second question as to whether the United States is on the ascent or decline depends a lot on whether the United States fully develops and understands and responds to the change of living in a global village, which is something relatively new in attitude for Americans. And I really believe that that is the key to what our future is. If you look back the past 10 years, there has been a dramatic change in the way this planet Earth has, what it's gone through. The most notable, I suppose, in the past decade has been the decline of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that sort of thing. That certainly has taken the most, received the most publicity. But in terms of, I think, the most important change that has gone by relatively unnoticed is the tremendous economic structural change that has taken place in the last decade. And I think when historians look at this period, they will write that the structural economic changes that have occurred in the decade of the 80s and the early 90s undoubtedly will be the most important, one of the three or four most important economic periods in the history of this country, and clearly the most important economic structural change that has occurred in at least 50, 60, 70 years, perhaps to the turn of the century, when Henry Ford introduced the assembly line mass production operations. Much of that change has been due to the dramatic advance in technology, whether you're talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall and communism. In my judgment, that was due primarily to the ability of technology to penetrate the Berlin Wall, that you could no longer hold out information, communications, and once those behind the Iron Curtain saw what truth was, saw what opportunity was, on the other side, the revolution basically bubbled up from the bottom. The same is true. Technology was the primary mover of change in this economic structure. If you consider the manufacturing base of the United States has gone down considerably in the last 10 years. The fact is, through technology, we are producing more in manufacturing with far fewer people, and technology has been the reason for that happening. If you just look at some industries and to see how this is affected, we've gone from a manufacturing to a service-oriented economy. 10 years ago, the big three automakers in the United States producing cars had about over 700,000 workers producing those cars. A relatively upstart retail operation called Walmart had about 60,000 people. 10 years later, the big three automakers, still producing more cars more efficiently, are doing it with a little over 400,000 workers. Walmart has over 700,000 workers. So that is just one dramatic example. Technology has also changed how markets operate. I saw this in the last 4 years as chairman of the American Stock Exchange in New York, that literally government could not hold back the financial services industry. You could try to regulate it, but billions and billions of dollars or equivalent currency crossed national borders in nanoseconds and could not be interfered by government regulations. And so I saw in those 4 years in the financial markets how we truly are living in a global village. And unless we adapt to that, we have a very limited future as an economic power. And so with the dramatic change, it is very important that we view our ascent or decline on the basis of attitudes. How do we change our attitudes in certain basic areas to meet the changes that are occurring by technology primarily all over the world? One of the first changes, and it's good news I think, is Americans' attitude about exports. For most of our national history, we have basically had a market that has grown and grown and grown. We're obviously, being Americans, understand this market, and we have done quite well. But we stagnated in about the 1970s and early 1980s, and we had to change our attitude about doing business in another land. And I think the good news is that we have largely made that change in attitude. If you look at what has happened since 1986, for example, when we were coming out of the deepest recession we've had since the Great Depression, almost all of the recovery we've had has been due to export growth. If you look at it on a total gross national product basis, today 15% of our gross domestic product is occupied by exports of goods and services to other lands. Just in the early 1960s, only 5%. As late as the 1970s, only about 7% of our GDP went into exports. Today it's 15%, and I think that's clearly going in the right direction. So we had an attitude change there that's very positive. One area that concerns me where we need an attitude change is in the area of education. Far too many of our secondary schools, in my judgment, and some higher institutions of higher education are, in essence, certification academies. They are not turning out educated students, and those they are turning out oftentimes are turned out with a specific education for a specific job sector. And I think as a country, we're going to have to look at education as we look to whether we're going to be on the rise or fall in the future. As a country, we're going to have to look at education and decide that quality is as important in education as it is in the total quality management that's been introduced in American industry in the past 10 years. I think we're going to have to look at education not so much as educating for a specific job, but instead to focus on learning how to learn, learning how to think, to adapt, to learn, to thrive in changing situations. Because if there's anything that's constant over into the 21st century, the constant will be change. And there will be a constant need to adapt to that kind of change. And that's where education is going to be a lifelong quest. And I think the government has to get back in to figuring out how we're going to meet that kind of change. Robert Reich, the current Labor Secretary, in a book that was published last year, talked about the global village, confirmed that we're living in a global village, global market, and he points out that the most important variable as to whether or not the United States or any country competes is the most important resource, namely the human resource, because you can move technology very easily. Obviously, you can move money, finances very easily. The least easy thing to move are your human resources, and if those are educated, able to adapt, your people, then you're going to be where the jobs are going to be located. So that's a question that's still out. as to what we're going to do about education in answering the question whether we're on the rise or the fall in the next century. Another very positive thing, which kind of leads me into Mexico, is the attitude change the United States has had toward its neighbors. When I left Congress and was on a board, a U.S.-Canadian board, bringing natural gas from Alberta to the northeast United States, it was half Canadian, half American. And we would talk frequently at our board meetings about political and economic situations in both countries. And often they would say, what do Americans, or what does Washington think about Canada? And the answer is, we didn't. We don't. And for the longest time, we had a very isolationist attitude about our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. That is changing, and it's changing in a very positive way. In the past, and most of our history, we have had a very paternalistic attitude about Mexico. The thing that is so interesting about the North American Free Trade Agreement and all that it portends is the fact that to enter that, you're entering it as partners, not as proprietors or parents, but as partners. And that is a major attitude change. And that portends very positively for the United States. Because if you're looking to where your jobs in the future are going to come from, where the growth is going to come from, the growth is going to come from what is now called the developing world: Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe. And it was phenomenally important that the United States pass and properly implement the North American Free Trade Agreement, because the developing world was looking very carefully at how we treated a developing nation, our neighbor Mexico. And Mexico was sort of the lens through which Latin America particularly saw the United States, and it was the door through which the United States enter all of these developing nations. And the fact that we passed it with some convincing, in a convincing way, and now we're in the implementing stage, I think is very positive for the United States. But to make this partnership between Mexico and the United States really work, not only did the United States have to change in attitudes, but Mexico had to change in attitude. I've been going to Mexico on either business or political issue reasons for the last 28 years. And I divide that experience in Mexico as the first 23 and the last 5. Because what has happened in Mexico in the last 5 years is truly a revolution. It's a revolution that is not an armed revolution, but it is a revolution in the way things have been done in Mexico, in attitudes, etc. For example, President Salinas, the present president of Mexico, in his last year in his 6-year term, President Salinas came in 1988, he was elected, and virtually turned the economic situation in Mexico on its head, turned it around. For example, 6 years ago, Mexico was one of the most protected, closed markets in the entire world. On their own, unilaterally, they started lowering tariffs, some as high as 100% or more, most in the 50% range, and they lowered them unilaterally to an average of 20%, making it one of the most open markets in the world. Inflation, because Mexico had basically adopted a form of socialism over the years and had relied on oil revenues, particularly in the 70s and early 80s, to spend and spend. And then the bottom fell out of the energy industry, and so the bottom fell out of the Mexican economy. 6-7 years ago, when President Salinas came in, inflation was running at almost 200%. And we complained about inflation in the late 70s when it was 21%. Inflation today, in 1993 in Mexico, was down to 7.5%. This year, 1994, it'll be down to 5%. We talk about budget deficits. We have a huge budget deficit in this country that has been created over the past decade or so. In Mexico, 6 years ago, they ran a budget deficit equal to 15% of their gross domestic product. Last year, the year before last, they ran surplus budgets of 1% of their gross domestic product. And that is a huge turnaround. 10 years ago, Mexico had about 1,250 industries, businesses, that were owned by the government, owned by the state. Many of those they accumulated when the recession hit, the businesses were going broke, and the government took them over. They arranged everything from televisions to newspapers to hotels to restaurants to steel mills to railroads to you name it. Today, less than 100 of those businesses are still in government hands. They've had the most aggressive privatization program anywhere in the world. They sold these companies with American financial institutions running the sales, evaluating the values, and they raised something like $23 billion, all of which they applied to reducing their debt obligations as opposed to running their operating budget. So those have all been remarkable economic turnarounds in Mexico's history. As a result, real wages in the manufacturing sector have been going up 7% a year. So the standard of living of Mexicans is going up. Economic reform, one of the major changes that have taken place under the Salinas government. Political reform is also in the process of taking place. In the past, the government owned the paper mills, and if a newspaper wanted to print something, they had to apply a license to the government to get the paper to print it on. If the newspapers printed things that were not liked by the government, they oftentimes found they couldn't get paper to print their papers. They privatized the paper industry, and now they don't have to go through the government to buy their paper, and it has created a sense of press freedom that has not been experienced in Mexico. If the government wanted its message out, they ran it on the government-owned television. They've privatized the television, again, creating a new sense of freedom of the press. Election reforms, another thing that is happening there. So there have been changes there. But I think perhaps the most important change that has happened, and this is due to really the credit of President Salinas, is the change in attitude, the change in mind of the Mexican people. And that has been truly a remarkable sense of change. Unless you've been there, you cannot appreciate. For example, Mexican textbooks over the years has been very open, very dramatic in pointing out that the United States stole half of Mexico. What is today Oregon, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas was part of Mexico just a century and a half ago. And to the Mexican children, all their lives has been the United States stole half of their country. And some of the wags in Mexico a few years ago said yes, and it was the half that had the paved roads. And that's also was true. Well, a lot has changed there. The textbooks no longer report the history of our relationship in that way. As far as paved roads are concerned, in the last 5 years, Mexico has put in 2,500 miles of new highway, mostly four-lane highway, and it's all been done without government money. They give private licenses, concessions for private financing. They build the roads. They're basically toll roads, but that's the way they are modernizing their infrastructure in road building. So the change in attitude, the change in relationship of Mexico to the rest of the world, and particularly Mexico and the United States, has been one that is truly remarkable. So if you look back the past 10 years, clearly technology has forced a lot of change. But leadership has also forced a lot of change. President Salinas in Mexico has done an absolutely remarkable job that every political leader that I know that goes to Mexico shakes their heads and says, how did you do it? But in this country, coming up with a NAFTA was also a question of leadership, and in this case, bipartisan leadership. In the 80s, President Reagan had a vision of a free trade zone from the Yucatan to Alaska. President Bush actually negotiated the basic tenets of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then President Clinton came in, and despite very strong protectionist pressures within his own party, had the courage to move that through, and Congress, on a bipartisan basis, basically faced down and said no to the politics of fear and insecurity and defeatism, and Congress, on a bipartisan basis, said yes to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And all that's an issue of leadership. And so as we look ahead, we've now had the North American Free Trade Agreement in effect 5 days. This is the 5th day. As of 5 days, half of the trade between the United States and Mexico has gone to zero tariffs. It goes through on both sides with no tariff, no taxes put on it whatsoever. Over the next 15 years, all trade between Canada, United States, and Mexico will be down to zero tariffs. Every day in the 4 months that I've been in Mexico as ambassador, every day a new business deal is being put together. We've made that at the embassy the #1 goal to advance the business interest of the United States in Mexico in a way that creates jobs here in the United States. And every day we're dealing with business people who are putting deals together in food processing, in retailing, in telecommunications, in energy, financial services, transportation, environmental services. All of these are going to be big winners this year and over the next few years, and they're going to create new jobs in this country as well as in Mexico. And in my judgment, that's just the beginning of what's going to happen. In my judgment, over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see at least a doubling in trade between our two countries. That's going to result in new jobs. Again, of all the econometric models that have been run, I would say the one that I believe most is approximately 300,000 new jobs will be created in the United States solely on the basis of new trade between the United States and Mexico over the next 2 to 3 years. So I think it's very important. It's important economically. It's important politically. When I was in Congress and was on the ranking Democrat on the Trade Subcommittee, I used to say that trade was the currency of peace. And the more we have commercial relationships where business people are doing business across national borders, the less likely we are to go to war, the more likely we are to try to understand each other and to get along with each other. I think that that's going to be the result of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I also believe that the North American Free Trade Agreement and this new relationship, particularly between the United States and Mexico, is going to expand rather quickly, rather dramatically, with probably Chile being the next country added to the NAFTA, and then a number of other countries are in line to become eligible to be free trade partners. When that happens, that's when the opportunities for the United States expands. If the educational system keeps up with the changes that are happening in this global village, then the answer to your overall theme, is America on the ascent or decline, is a very emphatic, we're on the ascent. There are real opportunities, real challenges, and a very bright tomorrow for this country and for the rest of the globe. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Let me seat a distinguished panel of questioners.
Okay.
And then they will ask you a question, and
Okay.
then we'll go to
Okay.
the audience from there.
Good.
I would ask our distinguished panelists if